Hey VR, welcome back to another Tuesday night Vertical Reality online live stream. We just want to thank you guys again for tuning in, for spending your valuable time here on this Tuesday night with us. We're just going to get right into things tonight. And once again, I want to start off by telling you guys a little bit of a story. So, when I was back in high school, there was a guy that I went to school with. He was the kicker for the varsity football team. And one afternoon in the summer, he went to school to practice his field goal kicking with a few of his friends for the upcoming season. And there were a lot of different school sports teams that practice on those fields behind our school. So equipment was constantly being hauled back and forth and moved all around. So to save space, the school had actually bought these two-in-one combination soccer net and field goal posts. Basically, they were just normal soccer nets that had two big tall posts that continued up in the air from the side posts of the soccer net. They had wheels so that they could be moved somewhat easily, and they were made of a pretty good quality metal, so they pretty much stayed out there all year round. So when the kicker and his friends arrived at the field that the nets were already or that were on were already in use. So he and his friends, all grabbed the side of the net and tipped it up onto its wheels and began to move the net onto another open field just across the way. There was only one small issue once they started moving that field goal, is that between them and the other field was an access road. And along that access road were utility poles that had wires carrying thousands of volts of electricity in them. So as the boys moved the nets, they didn't even think to watch out for those electrical lines. And sadly, every single one of those boys was very severely injured as those poles made contact with the wires, and they were literally thrown backwards from the force of the electricity flowing through them. This event was all over the papers. It was all over the news, and I remember those boys were out of school for quite some time, and they were in the hospital for a long time. And it was amazing to see that they all made a full recovery and that there were no lasting damages from the event. Nobody was seriously injured or, God forbid, killed, but it was nonetheless a very serious incident. And you may have learned this in school already, and if you're not, well, I'm about to teach you. When it comes to electricity, there is something called a ground wire. You see, when designing an electrical circuit, it is crucially important to have a wire that goes from the circuit directly into the ground, because electricity will always take the path of least resistance. A ground wire makes it so that any excess electricity in a circuit has a path to safely disperse itself into the earth. If a circuit is not properly grounded, then anything that happens to touch the circuit, including a kicker and a bunch of his friends moving a field goal post that's made out of metal, then that becomes the path of least resistance that the electricity takes to disperse itself into the ground, and they then become the ground. So why do I tell you this story? It's a great question. No, I tell you this story because the title of tonight's message is Grounded. And tonight I want to talk to you about what it means for us as humans, and specifically for us as followers of Jesus, to live the kind of life that is grounded in Him. Because just like electricity, when we are ungrounded, we are just one big accident waiting to happen. But the only true way that we are ever safe, the only true way that we can ever actually live and actually ever be free, is when we are grounded in God. So if you have your YouVersion apps, if you have your phones open, or if you have your Bible around, we are going to be starting off in Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 5 through 8. Jeremiah is in the prophets, and so he's after a lot of these stories, kind of like towards the tail end of the Old Testament, just past Psalms and Proverbs. But if you hit the New Testament, you've gone too far. Jeremiah is one of the prophets that wrote the most in the entire Old Testament. So once again, we're going to be in chapter 17, verses 5 through 8. I'm reading from the NIV here, and this is what Jeremiah has to say. He says, "This is what the Lord says. Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who draws strength from mere flesh and whose heart turns away from the Lord. That person will be like a bush in the wastelands. They will not see prosperity when it comes. They will dwell in the parched places of the desert, in a salt land where no one lives. But blessed is the one who puts trust in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when the heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought, and it never fails to bear fruit. So what is Jeremiah trying to say to us here? Well, Jeremiah is trying to say that just like a seed in the soil, we as followers of Jesus, and even bigger than that, we as humans were created to be grounded in God, created to have our roots in the soil of Jesus. We were not designed to live independently. Strength, security, confidence, and peace are all impossible to attain if you are looking for them in and of yourself. You need to know that the best attributes of the godliest people that you know, or of the most historic figures of our faith, everywhere from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. all the way back to Abraham himself back in Genesis, they did not develop these attributes by way of them trying to be the best versions of themselves that they could be. They had the ability to stand tall in the face of adversity, to love when times got tough, to make lasting impacts generations after they left this earth, not because they found those attributes somewhere deep down in themselves and they just had to find them and to bring them up to the surface. No, these people did all of those things because they dropped to their knees and said, God, you take the lead, and I'm going to follow in your footsteps, because I know in and of myself, I cannot define myself, I cannot strengthen myself, and I cannot lead myself. And if I do, I'm just going to be blind, and I'm going to be here one day and gone the next. But if I follow you, that is where the source of strength is. And that's what they did. With these people, their strength was not in their independence. Their strength was in their dependence on the source of strength. And that source is God himself. The verse that we just read says, "Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who draws strength from mere flesh, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. That person will be like a bush in the wastelands." So I just want you to stop and to think about that. Think about the middle of the Sahara Desert. What do you picture? You picture a bunch of sand, maybe a stray tumbleweed. And that's what Jeremiah is trying to say, is that the people who trust in man, the people who trust in themselves or trust in another person, and that's where they find their source of strength, that's where they find their confidence, that's where they find their peace. He said those people are just going to be the same spiritually as a tumbleweed rolling across the Sahara Desert is. That there's no life there. There's no promise there. There's no hope of a better future when you're just trusting in somebody else, because they have the same problem you do, is that at their core, they are empty. And so the second point that I want to make here is that if you're not grounded in God, then you will by default find somewhere else to ground yourself. And this is what Jeremiah is talking about. Everyone draws strength from someone or something. And this is why so many people turn to things like drugs or alcohol or excessive amounts of entertainment or the approval of others or boyfriend after boyfriend or girlfriend after girlfriend to fill up their empty and hurting hearts. If you're not grounded in God, then you will find something else to draw from. And I can promise you, speaking from personal experience, that doing this will only always leave you wanting more. Jesus himself actually talks about this idea that Jeremiah just brought up in John chapter 15, verses 5 through 6. If you're in the book of Jeremiah, you're going to just flip the pages to the left, go further into the Bible until you hit the New Testament. And you're going to look for the fourth book in, the book of John, this is what Jesus says in chapter 15. He says, I am the vine and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. So what's Jesus saying? Jesus is saying is that we as humans, we're not designed to grow on our own. The same way that branches on a tree, or in this case what Jesus says, branches on a vine, are not designed to grow on their own, but they grow out from their source. And as soon as they're broken off of their source, they just wither up. They no longer produce fruit. They're no longer good for food. They just wither up and die. They're lifeless. And eventually they just crumble. Why does that happen? Because they're no longer grounded. And that's what Jesus is saying. It's not a bad thing that's the way that we were created. That's just the way that we were created. We were created as a people needing something other than ourselves to fulfill ourselves. And until we find the only one who can actually fulfill us, we will always be needing and wanting more. And we will always be looking for it from one source or another. So before we go here, I want to break down what we just talked about into ways that we can actually apply this to our own life and what this actually means for us on a day-to-day basis. And the first point that I want to make here is that dependence means not having all of the answers. And I want to take a minute to talk about this because it's so important. You know, many of you guys know that right out of high school, I decided to go to Moody Bible Institute, and I graduated a couple years later with my associates in the Science of Biblical Studies. I have my diploma sitting right there up on a shelf on the wall. And at that time, looking back, you know, I realize now that a lot of the times when I approached the Bible and when I approached even my relationship with God, I was very concerned about having the right answers. When somebody asked me, what does this topic mean in the Bible? Or when somebody asked me, you know, what does Jesus mean when he's talking about this? You know, I wanted to have all of the right answers. And a lot of times, you know, I had answers for any question that anybody might want to ask me. I could break it down into a series of steps. I could, you know, make it into this perfect, nice formula that you could you could follow pretty easily. And I could draw you flow charts and pie graphs on a whiteboard to show you all of the ways that that topic that you just asked me about makes sense. And I realized years after graduating that really what I was doing wasn't, in not always, but in a lot of ways, what I was doing wasn't pursuing God himself. I was pursuing the answers that he provided. And I was so secure in my bubble. I was so secure in my box that I had everything figured out, and everything was so nice and neat and organized. And I was like a painter looking at a table, and all of his paintbrushes are going exactly the right way, and all of his paints are lined up perfectly on the table, and everything's clean and exactly organized. And that's the way that my idea of God was. And slowly over time, he began to help me realize that he doesn't fit in my boxes, that he doesn't fit in my answers, in my nice, neat formulas, in my theologies, and in my pie graphs, or my pie charts. God is so much bigger than I ever could have imagined. And our pursuit of answers is not a bad thing, as long as having answers is not the most important thing in our lives, and instead seeking the living answer is the end goal of our pursuit of God. Jesus himself is the answer to these questions. Jesus himself, his presence, an ongoing developing relationship that grows over time, where we get to know our Creator more and more and become more and more comfortable in his presence and in his leadership, in his love and in his compassion. That's what Christianity is all about. And now, you know, I like to think that if you would ask me the same question that you would have asked me 4 years ago, I would have a completely different answer. And now my answer would just simply be, maybe, depending on the topic, I don't really know. But I know the one who does. And I know he's good. And I trust him. And now that has become enough for me, and it has radically changed my approach to pursuing a relationship with God. So number one, dependence means not having all of the answers. Because of having all of the answers, it's what's important to you. You're no longer going to be dependent on God, but you're only going to be dependent on having the right answers. Point number two is that dependence means giving up control. So many times in our day-to-day lives, the only reason why we don't have time to pray, the only reason why we don't have time to read our Bibles, so many times we don't have time to worship, it's really only because we get busy. We get busy because we're so consumed with controlling our lives, controlling every aspect of our lives. We have all of these things that we're involved in, and we have a death grip sometimes on our own lives, on our own schedules, that we get so busy with our own stuff that we just kind of overlook the God stuff. And if we ever want to let go of this pursuit of independence, if we ever want to turn and we ever want to know what it feels like to live in that freedom that God has for us, we have to give up our control. The control of our own lives, the control of our own schedules, the control even of our friend groups, the control of making our decisions. Because dependence is all about sharing with someone else, and independence is all about doing it yourself. And it's a difficult thing to do. But when we surrender over to God, who has our best interest in mind, that is when we experience freedom. And the third point I want to make is this, is that dependence means giving up your definition of right and wrong. And this might be difficult for some of us, especially in a time period that is so divided and is so polarized on every issue, every topic. Anything that you see today in the news, you have a one side on the left and another side on the right, and there's a line down the middle, and they are at war. There is conflict in this day and age. And what all of that stems from is honestly, it's a big word called subjective morality. And what that means is that everybody on this earth, in their own minds, defines for themselves what is right and wrong. If you go down the street and you were to poll 10 people on any given topic, you would, and their opinion on the rightness or wrongness of that topic, you would get 10 different answers. Because one person would say, yeah, that's terrible. And then the next person would say, no, I really don't care. And the next person would say, yeah, that's a huge issue, and I think it's really good. And then you would have these people that all make their own definition, their own morality on this one subject. And then when you multiply that times the billions of people who live on this earth, you have billions of different opinions on what is right and what is wrong. And there's wars that are fought over this. There are massacres that have happened in human history just because one person disagreed with the other person about a serious subject, and it meant a lot to both of them. And the only way that we can give up that insane pursuit of independence is by letting God define for us what right and wrong means. Let God and the Bible define for us what is good and what is bad. And it is then and only then that we will truly find freedom. Not when we're living for ourselves, not when we are trying to do things for ourselves, but when we lay ourselves down and say, God, you lead the way. So as we close tonight, I just wanted to let you know that this week we are going to be going through another 7-day devotional plan on the YouVersion app, where we're going to talk through this conversation that we started tonight. So parents, students, leaders, I encourage you all to read along with us throughout this next week. But this week's reading plan is a little special because this devotional series is actually called Crave, and it is written by the lead singers of the band For King and Country. I know around this time we're usually gearing up for our annual trip to Kingdom Bound. So even though we won't be going this year, we can at least get some godly and wise perspectives on a lot of the very same topics that we talked about tonight from one of our favorite Christian music artists every single year. So I know that I'm definitely going to be looking forward to reading that plan throughout this week, and I really hope you are as well. I just want to say thank you all again for tuning in tonight. Thank you for your time. We love you so much, and we will talk to you throughout the week and see you next week, Tuesday at 7 p.m. Thanks, guys.